Welcome to Xi Jinping Briefing. The content of the briefing includes: China's ousted foreign minister had an affair with TV host, FT reports. UN Human Rights Chief demands urgent action to end unspeakable tragedy in Myanmar. China has second thoughts about controlling prices in its massive housing market. Taiwan security chief says AUKUS, NATO must counter China threat. China has poured billions into Africa's infrastructure. Is it now tightening the tap? China's ousted foreign minister had an affair with TV host, FT reports. CNN. China's ousted foreign minister, Qin Gang, reportedly had an extramarital affair with a high-profile Chinese television presenter, Fu Xiaotian, who had a child through surrogacy in the United States, according to multiple unnamed sources cited in a report by the Financial Times. Fu, a former host of a flagship talk show on Hong Kong-based broadcaster Phoenix TV, was allegedly in a relationship with Qin. The FT report adds more intrigue to the unexplained disappearance and removal of the senior diplomat. Rumors about Qin's alleged affair with Fu have been swirling on China's heavily censored social media for months, since Qin first disappeared from the public eye in June. Qin served as the Chinese ambassador to Washington before being appointed foreign minister in December 2020. The report comes after the Wall Street Journal reported last week that Chinese officials were told that an internal Communist Party investigation found Qin to have been engaged in an extramarital affair that led to the birth of a child in the U.S. while serving as China's envoy to Washington. UN Human Rights Chief demands urgent action to end unspeakable tragedy in Myanmar. Diplomat. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, has called for radical action to end the unspeakable tragedy unfolding in Myanmar. In a speech to the UN Human Rights Council, Turk described the human rights violations committed by Myanmar's military regime as inhumanity in its vilest form and called for new thinking to bring an end to the crisis. He also called for Myanmar to be referred to the International Criminal Court. Turk highlighted the airstrikes, mass killings, and burning of villages carried out by the junta, as well as the denial of humanitarian access throughout the country. China has second thoughts about controlling prices in its massive housing market. Wall Street Journal. Chinese cities are starting to lift price restrictions on housing, leading to concerns about the impact on the real estate market and the wider economy. Over the past 2 years, many cities imposed price controls to stabilize property values. However, as the market continues to struggle, there are growing calls to loosen the rules. Chengdu, for example, recently removed price restrictions for projects on newly sold land and abandoned government guidance prices for existing homes. This could help developers clear inventories of unsold properties and pay off their debts, but it could also lead to larger drops in home prices, damaging consumer confidence and potentially destabilizing the financial system. Average new home prices in 100 major Chinese cities dipped just 0.2% YoY in August, while existing home prices fell 2.4% over the past year. In comparison, U.S. home prices fell nearly 20% between 2006 and 2008. China is also potentially facing a debt crisis, with developers having more than 313 million square meters of unsold residential development as of August 2021, up 20% YoY. Taiwan security chief says AUKUS, NATO must counter China threat. Nikkei Asia. Taiwan's National Security Council Secretary-General Wellington Koo-Lee-Sung has warned that China's expansionist drive needs to be checked by US-led alliances. According to Koo, the Security Pact AUKUS, a partnership between Australia, the UK, and the US, and NATO's help in countering Chinese military threats in Asia is necessary. Koo noted that Malaysia and Indonesia have pushed back against China's new map claiming sovereignty over Taiwan and other territories, and disputed boundaries along the Sino-Indian border. Koo warned that China's naval power expansion is a concern for countries in the region. China has poured billions into Africa's infrastructure. Is it now tightening the tap? CNN. Chinese funding for major infrastructure projects in Africa, under the Belt and Road Initiative, is declining. Researchers from the Boston University Global Development Policy Center have found that new loan commitments from Chinese entities to African government borrowers fell from $28.5 billion in 2016 to just under $1 billion last year. The decline is not only due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but also indicates a broader shift towards lending that may see fewer large-scale loans. Concerns over debt repayment, China's own financial problems and an increased focus on environmental issues are putting pressure on how China lends and countries borrow. What peak oil will mean for China? Financial Times. China's oil demand is expected to peak in the next few years as the country's rapid uptake of electric vehicles, EVs, reduces its reliance on imported crude. EVs accounted for 37% of all new car sales in China last month, according to HSBC Global Research. China's energy mix is shifting towards coal and renewables, reducing its dependence on oil. This shift is significant as China has been the driving force behind global oil demand growth since joining the World Trade Organization in 2001. Experts predict that China's oil demand will peak by the end of the decade, which will then lead to a global peak in demand. China's transition away from oil is part of the country's efforts to meet its climate targets. While China has set ambitious goals for emissions reductions, it still faces challenges in balancing economic growth with carbon reduction initiatives. As China's oil demand slows, the market is being increasingly driven by demand for petrochemicals. Petrochemicals are expected to account for 85% of incremental global oil demand growth before 2030. China is benefiting from the Sikh murder fallout. Bloomberg. The recent fallout between Canada and India over the murder of a Sikh activist is straining the ties that bind the Quad together, a grouping of the US, Japan, India, and Australia. China is watching this potential fracturing of the alliance closely and stands to gain the most from the current impasse. The West's deliberate blindness to the authoritarianism that has taken root in India under Prime Minister Narendra Modi is a key reason why the US and its partners are in this position. If the US wants to counter China's influence in the region, it needs to repair the damage with India quickly. As China's property sector crumbles, who takes the fall? Foreign policy. 2 former executives of China Evergrande Group, a property giant, have been detained by Chinese authorities. The arrests of former CEO Xia Haijun and former CFO Pan Darong follow the detentions of staff from subsidiary Evergrande Wealth Management. This indicates that the property sector remains risky for both China and the bankers and officials involved in it. Evergrande is potentially facing liquidation, along with other property developers. It has many creditors, both at home and abroad, who are concerned that there is no new debt plan and that the firm's restructuring efforts are doomed. An Evergrande subsidiary missed a $547 million bond payment on Monday. The company's shares fell by 19.1% following the announcement. The property sector makes up 30% of China's GDP. As the sector crumbles, the government needs scapegoats. So far, it has focused on property executives and banking officials. However, local government officials are likely to start blaming each other for the crisis, which will lead to more arrests. Missing Chinese minister fathered child for mistress with U.S. surrogate. Telegraph. China's former foreign minister, Qin Gang, reportedly fathered a child with his television presenter mistress, Fu Xiaotian, using a surrogate mother in the U.S. Surrogacy is banned in China, so the couple allegedly used this method to have a child. The relationship between Qin Gang and Fu Xiaotian is currently being investigated by authorities in Beijing. The situation could be embarrassing for China if it is revealed that the child is a U.S. citizen. Qin Gang was dismissed from his role as foreign minister in July for undisclosed reasons, but it is believed that his extramarital affair and the birth of a child in the U.S. were factors in his dismissal. Beijing aims to snatch the entire South China Sea. The U.S. Navy is backing down. Telegraph. China's recent activities in the South China Sea, including placing a buoyed net around the Scarborough Shoal and intercepting Filipino fishing boats, demonstrate its determination to assert its claims of indisputable sovereignty within the Nine-Line. The Chinese government has dismissed a 2016 ruling from The Hague that its claims to waters inside the Nine-Line were without legal foundation. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea provides a clear framework for dividing maritime territories, but China has chosen to disregard it. The author warns that ignoring China's actions could have serious consequences, including a risk of escalation that could result in loss of life. The international community needs to uphold international law and work together to counter Chinese belligerence. This includes strengthening alliances, tightening maritime legal provisions, and promoting economic resilience. The recent resolution of a boundary dispute between Indonesia and Vietnam is a positive example of what can be achieved. The author suggests that a united front, backed by U.S. military might, is the best solution for now. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your favorite observer from the 6 Degrees World, Dr. Six, here to wrap up our news bulletin. Today we covered a range of topics, from scandalous affairs to human rights abuses, from China's housing market to its influence in Africa, and from the future of oil demand to the strained relationships within the Quad Alliance. So let's dive in and analyze these stories, shall we? First off, we learned that China's ousted foreign minister, Qin Gang, allegedly had an affair with a TV host, Fu Xiaotian. This scandal adds a juicy twist to Qin's mysterious disappearance from the public eye. But hey, let's not judge a person's personal life. as long as they're doing their job, right? Speaking of jobs, the UN human rights chief called for urgent action to end the unspeakable tragedy in Myanmar. The military regime there has been committing heinous human rights violations, and it's high time the international community steps in to put an end to it. Moving on, China seems to be having second thoughts about controlling prices in its massive housing market. Some cities are lifting price restrictions, which could lead to both positive and negative consequences. On one hand, it might help developers clear their inventories and pay off debts. On the other hand, it could lead to larger drops in home prices and potentially destabilize the financial system. So, to buy or not to buy, that is the question. Meanwhile, Taiwan's security chief called for AUKUS and NATO to counter China's expansionist drive. China's naval power expansion is raising concerns for countries in the region, and they're looking for support from their allies to keep the dragon at bay. And speaking of dragons, China's funding for infrastructure projects in Africa is declining. This could be due to concerns over debt repayment, China's own financial problems, and an increased focus on environmental issues. So, Africa might have to look elsewhere for its infrastructure needs. Next up, we learned that China's oil demand is expected to peak in the next few years as the country embraces electric vehicles and shifts towards coal and renewables. This is a significant shift, considering that China has been the driving force behind global oil demand growth for the past 2 decades. As China transitions away from oil, the market is increasingly driven by demand for petrochemicals. So, if you're an oil company, it might be time to invest in some test tubes and beakers. Moving on, the recent fallout between Canada and India over the murder of a Sikh activist is straining the ties within the Quad alliance. China is watching this closely and stands to benefit from any fractures in the alliance. So, if the US wants to counter China's influence in the region, it needs to fix things with India ASAP. And speaking of fixing things, the property sector in China is crumbling, and people are looking for someone to blame. Former executives of China Evergrande Group have been detained, but the finger-pointing might not stop there. Local government officials could start blaming each other, leading to more arrests. It's like a game of musical chairs, but with handcuffs. Lastly, we learned that China's former foreign minister, Qin Gang, allegedly fathered a child with his TV presenter mistress using a surrogate in the US. Oh, the scandal! This situation could be quite embarrassing for China if it turns out the child is a US citizen. And speaking of embarrassing situations, China's activities in the South China Sea are causing tensions in the region. The international community needs to uphold international law and counter Chinese belligerence. A united front, backed by US military might be the best solution for now. Well, that's all the news for today, folks. Remember, these are just my analyses and opinions, and I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. So, what do you think about these stories? Do you have any burning questions or insightful comments? Let's keep the discussion going. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.